Welcome to Syntax, a Generative Introduction, 4th edition. My name is Andrew Carnie. I'm a professor of linguistics at the University of Arizona. I'm the author of your textbook, and I'll be leading you through this series of video tutorials. In this video, we take another descriptive detour into looking at some semantic notions that are relevant for figuring out how our syntax works. In particular, I'm going to distinguish four often very highly confused semantic relationships that show up in the English auxiliary and inflectional system. In particular, we're going to look at the differences between tense, aspect, voice, and mood. These are terms that people often confuse. I've heard people on NPR referring to things like the passive tense. This is incoherent because passive is a voice, not a tense. Often people talk about the progressive tense. This is again incoherent because progressive is an aspect. So it will help us here to spend a few moments talking about the distinctions between tense, aspect, voice, and mood, and the different tenses, aspects, voices, and mood that are found in English. Tense refers to the relationship between two times. There's an event time. That's the time in which an action or state of being occurs or has happened. The utterance time, by contrast, is the time of speaking, hearing, reading, or writing of the sentence. The past tense is a tense in where the event time happens before the utterance time. In English, this is marked by a special verb form called the preterite, which is sometimes spelt with an E and sometimes without, but it's always pronounced preterite. These are forms in English like the ones that are marked with the ed suffix, as in danced, but they can also show up in special irregular verb forms like ran. Preterite refers to both those forms with the past tense suffix and those special forms. In the past tense, we have the event time before the utterance time, and it's marked by the preterite. The present tense in English is typically marked with the S suffix, as in he dances. In this situation, the event time is the same as the utterance time. Now, there is one little quirk about English present tense. It doesn't always mean immediate present tense. It can also sometimes have a habitual reading. So if I say things like he dances, that sort of implies he dances all the time. We're going to leave that complication aside for the moment and just take the simple meaning where it's an event happening right now. The future tense is one where the event time happens after the utterance time. So you're saying something about an action occurring not now but later. These are often marked in English with the modal auxiliary will. Will is an interesting auxiliary because it both marks the present tense and it also implies a modal force of this is going to happen no matter what. In English, we can also indicate something will happen in the future by simply using the present tense combined with a future adverb, like I leave next week or he leaves next week. So sometimes the future tense in English is not marked with will. It's marked in other ways. But we're going to concentrate on the occasions when it is marked with will. Next, we have mood. Mood refers to things like the possibility, probability, necessity, obligation, and ability. We've already talked about the modal force of the word will, which indicates that something is definitely going to happen. It's necessary. But there are many other moods, indicating that something is a possibility, a probability, an obligation, ability. And modal auxiliaries are the typical form for marking these moods. So these are words like can, could, may, might, would, shall, should, must, and ought. Those are all modals, and modals indicate mood. There's other ways of indicating mood. So for example, you can use adverbs. You could say, he probably will leave. Probably is also indicating a mood. And you can also use certain kinds of embedding adverbs, things like he is able to leave. That's reflecting ability. But modals are the most usual form for expressing mood. And they're the ones we're going to concentrate on in this unit of the class. Now, aspect is often confused with tense. And part of the problem has to do with the way in which we talk about aspectual marking. Aspect is about the time of an event relative to some reference point that we identify as speakers. We call this reference point the reference time. One of the easiest ways to identify what a reference time is by putting in a when phrase, a when clause. There's two aspects in English that we mark morphologically, and we're going to concentrate on those two. There are many, many, many other kinds of aspect, but these are the two that show up in English. One is the perfect aspect, and the perfect aspect indicates that the event time happened before the reference time. This implies that the event is completed relative to the reference time. So for example, I had fallen when he arrived. In that situation, the falling had been completed, then he arrived. So the event time happened before the reference time being when he arrived. The progressive aspect is when the reference time and the event time overlap. So I was falling when he arrived. I was still falling during his arrival. So that is a case where the reference time and the event time overlap. Now we're going to talk about how we mark these two different aspects in a second. We have to sort of break them apart because it turns out it's quite a complicated system we have in English for marking these relationships. So first of all, I need to define some terminology. And I'm going to use definitions that are not the same as the definitions you may have learned in school. The definitions you may have used in school, unfortunately, are very confusing because they seem to mix up tense and aspect. So you may have heard of things called the past participle. This is forms of the verb like he has eaten, danced, drunk, and hit. Those are all forms that are participles. They're called past participles, I think, because they're trying to indicate the completive portion of the perfect aspect. But the problem is that they're not always in the past tense. So for example, you can have present tense and future tense forms of these. So he will have danced. That's a perfect. That's in the future. And he has danced. It seems like that's in the past tense, but it's actually in the present because you're using has. And has is a present tense marked auxiliary. So the idea that this is a past participle is highly problematic because it can refer to situations right now or in the future. So instead, we're just not going to call these past participles. We're going to call them participles, flat out participles. They are typically marked with either the en suffix, as in eaten, or sometimes they're marked with the ed suffix, as in danced. You have to be very careful about those forms with those ed suffixes because ed can also mark the preterite in the past tense. So in a sentence like he will have danced, this is very tricky because you've got that ed suffix there, but it doesn't mean past tense, right? He will have danced is about an action that happens in the future. So you can have participles with this ed marking that are not past tense. So just be a little careful about that. English morphology is a little tricky. The other kind of item that you may have heard talked about, you may have heard of a present participle. A present participle is the form that ends in ing, like he is eating, dancing, drinking, hitting, right? those are all ing forms. Those are present participles. But I want to get away, for the same reasons that I got away from past participle, from present participle. These can be in the future. He will be eating. They can be in the past. He has been eating. Right? So you have all those occurrences where the tense marking indicates that it's actually not present. So the term present participle is deeply confusing. So instead, we're going to call it something else. We're going to call it a gerund. Now the word gerund in traditional grammar is restricted to nominal usages of verbs with the ing suffix. So the eating of the apple, the dancing was out of control. Those kinds of phrases are gerunds. But I want to extend that usage of the word gerund to include present participles, these things that were traditionally called present participles. Why is this okay? It's because in every single instance, the gerund form is identical to the present participle form. So there's no harm in calling these gerunds. They are morphologically identical to nominal gerunds. All right, so we have two things. We have participles, traditionally called past participles. These are the forms that end in ed or d. They can also have specialized forms like drunk. And the gerund, which are always the forms that end in ing. Now, these two things are critical to understanding how we mark aspect, but they're not the only thing. It turns out that what's important is also the auxiliary you have. So the present aspect, the perfect aspect is always marked with have plus a participle. And that have can be inflected for any tense. So I had eaten, that's a past perfect. I have eaten, that's a present perfect. And I will have eaten, that's a future perfect. In each case, we have the auxiliary verb have, plus we have a participle. We have the progressive aspect, which is always marked with the verb to be and a gerund. So we have I was eating, that's a past progressive. So the auxiliary is in the past form, and the verb is in the gerund form, giving us the past progressive. I am eating, that's in the present progressive. Am is present tense. Eating is a gerund. That gives us the present progressives. I will be eating. That's the future progressive, because I've got the will marker, and then I have the auxiliary be and the gerund. So perfect aspect is always have plus participle. Progressive aspect is always be, or some form of the verb to be, and the gerund. And those auxiliaries of have and be will be inflected for the relevant tense. It's important to note that aspect and tense are independent of one another. We've already mentioned that. So I had eaten, past perfect. I have eaten, present perfect. I will have eaten, future perfect. It's also the case that we have I was eating, past progressive. I am eating, present progressive. I will be eating, future progressive. And guess what? You can combine the aspects. So you can have I had been eating, that's the past perfect progressive. I have been eating, that's the present perfect progressive. And I will have been eating, which is the future perfect progressive. What we have in these three sentences is we have an auxiliary, a have auxiliary, that's one part of it. We have a be auxiliary, that's been, and then we have the verb form. The be auxiliary is in its participial form, been, and the actual verb is in its progressive form, the gerund, eating. And the have auxiliary is inflected for tense. Wow, that's complicated, right? I will have been eating is one of those things that drives non-native speakers of English up the wall. How on earth do you remember to put all those auxiliaries in, and what do each of them mark? Now, as I've mentioned, you can combine these. I had been eating, I have been eating, I will have been eating. Been is the participial form of be, so have plus been gives us perfect. And been plus eating, which is in the gerund, is the progressive. Have been eating is the perfect progressive. Okay, one more distinction. This is the distinction known as voice, and I bring it up here because it intricately interacts with the aspect in the tense system. Voice represents the changes to the number and position of the arguments involved with a predicate. So the object, if you like, the theme of the sentence is in the complement position to a verb when you have an active voice. So Calvin ate the beef waffles. The beef waffles are the complement to the verb eat, and that means that they are in object position. This is an active sentence. The passive, by contrast, uses a completely different construction. In the passive, themes are in the subject position. That is, sort of the logical objects are in the subject position, and the logical subject or the agent are marked by a biphrase, optionally marked as a biphrase. And then you get this particular verb form, which is the verb to be plus the participle. Now, it's very important that you note this property of the bits that are involved in the passive voice. The logical object is in the subject position. The logical subject is in an optional biphrase, and you have the special voice form of the verb, which is the verb to be plus a participle. A lot of people misunderstand the passive, and they think that any expression that's vague is a passive. It isn't. Only these constructions are passives. Vague sentences are something else entirely. You can have a vague sentence that's active. Also, sometimes people mix up the perfect with the passive, and they try to avoid perfect, which is just crazy. The passive has just these and only these properties. The object, the logical object, is in subject position. The logical subject or agent is in the biphrase, and the verb is marked with a be auxiliary plus the participle. Actives are unmarked. Only passives are marked. Putting it all together, we see this really quite complicated pattern of aspect and voice. You can't tell whether something is a perfect or a passive or a progressive just by looking at the auxiliary or just by looking at what the verb form is. Because both perfects and passives are marked with participles, and both progressives and passives are marked with be forms. So it's this unique combination of have plus participle is perfect, be plus gerund is progressive, and be plus participle is passive. You can't have any other combinations, but when you have those particular combinations, what you're going to get are those specific meanings. What's even more spectacular is how these interleave with each other. So let's take the sentence, Shannon had been being beaten. I'm sorry for the violence of the sentence, but I needed one that was easily passivized. So poor Shannon. But what we have here is a passive. We know it's a passive because the object of the verb to beat is in the subject position, Shannon. Then what we have is a have auxiliary that's marked as the past tense, had. right? Then we have a be auxiliary, which is in its participial form. Then we have a be auxiliary that's in its gerund form. And then we have the main verb, which is in its participle form. So let's look at how that combines together to give us our various parts of tense, aspect, and voice. First of all, we have at the right-hand edge of the sentence, we have the verb be that is combined with the participle form of the verb beat. This gives us the passive. Before that, we have the verb, the auxiliary be, which is combined with the ing gerund form, strangely, of another be auxiliary, to give us the progressive. And to form the perfect, we have the have auxiliary combined with the en, which is also on an auxiliary verb, to give us the perfect. And then just to round it out, we have the special preterite past tense form of the verb have, which is had, and that gives us the tense. So this is a past, perfect, progressive, passive sentence. You'll notice that each item consists of two bits. There's the form of the auxiliary, and then the form of the verb that follows it, whether that be a participle or a gerund, and whether the auxiliary be or have, determines what the particular aspect and voice is being marked.